One of the themes of what we've discussed so far is the need to kind of critically examine simple stories that can be about civilizations, that can be propagandistic or can be done in order to further an agenda. One of the difficulties that you face as a historian is disentangling the stories that are told by people within the civilization from the actual facts of what happened. And in many ways, you're talking about how people like Bannon and Musk, oversimplify or misunderstand the actual facts of Roman history. But you point out that they do so in part because these stories are spread within the civilization itself. So you face a formidable task as a historian of distinguishing the propaganda of the time from what is actually occurring.
Oh my God, absolutely. It is the eternal problem of the ancient historian, that our evidence is so fragmentary, and also that it is more biased than, basically any sort of modern history towards the opinions of the elite. And so it is incredibly hard to separate propaganda from reality. There has been some incredibly useful work done in recent years with archaeological data that has really led us to question a lot of the theories that we'd held for a long time about, say, population decline and the relationship of that to the fall of the Republic and also to the empire, which is obviously the theory that Musk was promoting. It has become clear in recent years that there is not this kind of long-term dramatic population decline, which leads directly into the fall of the empire. There are some demographic shocks, but they seem to be much more related to sort of limited external events. So things like the Antonine and Cyprian plagues. And we can draw a much less clear line from that into the failure of the empire than we thought that we could do kind of 70 years ago. It was a very satisfying narrative, but unfortunately, it does not appear to be true. And I think that that's a really good example of a place where, had we not gained that new information that we gained really quite recently, we would have no reason to doubt the narratives that we were being given, and no reason to think about the political reasons that might be underlying the propagation of those narratives in the first place. And so I think it reminds you, when you look at something like that you have to think about the reasoning that might lie behind any sort of pronouncement or claim or diagnosis.
I mean, you point out in your Times op-ed that you could look back at the leading Roman historians, and you could point out, you'd say, Livy complained that the Romans of his day could endure neither our vices nor their cures. You talk about how Sallust attributed the political convulsions of the late Republic to the vices he believed that had spread through Rome like a deadly plague. So you could go back to the best historians of the time and end up completely wrong.
I think also that is so the focus on vice and political vice is so indicative of how the Romans view their world. This is a world in which there is no separation between, say, politics and religion. There is a much more porous boundary between this world and the divine world. And there is not so much of a written constitution in Rome as there is, say, in America. So much more of it is based on sort of normative conventions of behavior. And so this separation between a world of sort of political action, moral action, and even kind of divine favor, all of those boundaries are much more blurred. And so you are much more likely, I think, to read any sort of political crisis as a crisis of human vice and potentially of resultant kind of divine displeasure. And I think part of that is it's this political narrative, but also part of it is that is just the first place that the ancient mind will tend to go. And you see it, for example, every time they have a military crisis, the first thing that they will try and do is kind of work out where there have been sources of religious pollution in the city, and they will try and do kind of ceremonies of expiation. And so it clearly is just the first thought. So you have that, and then you have the additional layer that this is a very useful narrative if you are coming in and saying as a politician, I can identify this point of crisis and I'm going to fix it, and we are going to restore the great virtue of the Roman people that has given us this empire. And so you have these kind of two layers of bias, both conscious and unconscious, that we need to try and sort of strip back.
Well, you had a whole Substack post about the Spartans fighting the Persians and how our understanding of what actually happened in the battle, in the war, comes in part from the quite satisfying and self-adulatory story that the Greeks tell about what happened after the fact.
I think Thermopylae is such a it's a perfect case study, because we can see the layers as they sort of as they grow up over time. So the story that we tell about Thermopylae is that it's kind of these 300 heroic Spartans holding off the entire invasion army of the Persian King of Kings, and that it is this battle between the liberty-loving Greeks and this sort of evil bogeyman invading Persian Empire. And that is a very, very compelling story. But I think when you actually look at the history, you can see that the real story is a little less satisfying. It's actually a much larger Greek force, just kind of centered around this elite Spartan 300. And it's also, a pretty terrible defeat in the short run. Everyone is killed. They don't hold off the Persian army for that long. But it is rewritten, I think, very quickly, because it's an incredibly useful kind of propaganda sort of coup for the Greeks. It's a way to say to the other Greek states who are perhaps on the fence about whether to go over to the Persian side, to say, like, this is the heroic image in which you should be fighting, to kind of unite the Greek forces against the Persian enemy. And so there's that first layer of kind of immediate necessity of propaganda. And then over the hundreds of years that follow, we see new elements being added to the story. We get these very dramatic, almost cinematic scenes of the Spartans leaving Sparta when they know they're going to die. We get all these incredible quotes that, we see verbatim essentially in the movie 300, things like, "Eat well because tonight we dine in hell," or "Molon labe," which means "come and take them," which is what the Spartan commander allegedly says when the Persian king demands that he lay down his weapons. And I think those additions are reflective of what is becoming a mythologization of Sparta as a whole in the kind of hundreds of years between Thermopylae and the kind of 1st century BC and AD writers. Sparta is becoming this iconic symbol of a very specific way of life. And so you get all of these legends being sort of attached to this great Spartan moment. And then now we see these things being used in a different way for different purposes. So Molon labe, as you know, is quite often used as a sort of slogan by far-right groups, by kind of pro-gun groups. And the way in which they're using it is to assert their liberty from governmental intervention, which is an entirely different sort of liberty to the liberty that the Greeks were asserting. They were asserting liberty in terms of the liberty of a state to govern itself as it chose. There was no sense that then the individuals within that state had liberty from their government's decisions. Sparta was an incredibly unindividualistic society. Everyone was essentially forced to live as the state commanded and to subsume themselves into this militaristic culture.
As I was reading your work to prepare for this, and these themes of distinguishing story from fact came up over and over, I couldn't help but think about the historians 2,000 years in the future of our own time, and I thought, what if the only thing that survives is Donald Trump's speeches, the picture of him standing up after the assassination attempt, Curtis Yarvin's blog posts, and the future historians are trying to piece together a narrative, and they're like, well, there was a crisis of manliness, the civilization was in decline, and then finally it had its redeemer.
Oh my god, it's terrifying.
Yeah.
That is a horrible image. Thank you so much for that. I think the one element of hope that I would say is that I think that now the forms of media that are open to politicians are also very often open to the people and to their opponents. So social media and kind of newspapers, things like that. Like you're getting both sides. Whereas the forms of media that survive from the ancient world were very much forms of media that were only open to the ruling classes. So things like inscriptions, honorific sculptures, and also written works are really kind of written by members of the male elite. And so you get quite a good picture sometimes of factions and kind of problems and tensions within the elite, but we get a very poor picture of what people beyond that elite thought, because the forms of media in which they're expressing their political opinions, which we get these kind of tantalizing glimpses of, were very ephemeral. It was things like shouting at politicians in the theatre, or scrawling sort of witty graffiti over the bottom of someone's sculpture, or actually even setting up sort of private shrines to murdered populists. So we get these kind of glimpses of how they were expressing their opinion, but they were not expressing it in ways that survive over a period of 2,000 years.
Hope you're enjoying this interview. If you want to listen to full-length current affairs interviews before they are made fully available to the public, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/currentaffairs and become a supporter today.